Hello, everyone, and a good morning to you. Russ Barkley here again from Richmond, Virginia. Going to talk about ADHD research this morning, as always, on my Saturday broadcast. As always, we are going to start again with dad jokes. And I found these over at the website, thecommunityatlassian.com. And I think this one's pretty good. So you see the picture here? I changed all my passwords to Kenny. Now I have all Kenny logins. It's just wordplay, people. Just a lot of puns, but sometimes they can be fun. All right, the second one for you this morning is just below it. 90% of bald people still own a comb. They just can't part with it. Hey, I know this one personally, believe me. That hurts. That really hurts. Okay, moving along from those of us who are follicularly challenged or divergent, let's have a look at our 5 studies for this week. First up is going to be a study on the healthcare utilization and the associated costs that are linked to having ADHD in the pediatric population, and then looking at how that changed if ADHD was also associated with anxiety or depression or both. So this is really a health economics look at ADHD, but it's very important, I think, that countries, societies, insurance companies, governments have a good understanding of how expensive ADHD can be and why it needs to be managed properly. So in this case, this is a study that comes out of the US, and it's using a very large database that looks at individuals who were diagnosed with ADHD. These are children, 6 months before or 12 months after they were looking at the database to make sure that they had been diagnosed. So these are kids who were diagnosed between 2015 and 2021, to be more specific. They subdivided the kids into those with pure ADHD, those who had ADHD and or depression, but they also looked at ADHD with anxiety only, depression only, and both in their analyses. So they're using over 204,000 ADHD cases that were ADHD only, and they're comparing them to about 66,000 individuals who had ADHD with anxiety or depression. So huge database here. So very, I think, robust results. You can't say the study had low statistical power, which it certainly did not. So what did they find overall in these children? They found, as you might expect when you think about it, that the utilization of healthcare was greatest in individuals with comorbidity of anxiety and or depression compared to ADHD. So what was the difference? Well, in terms of visits to various centers, they found that there was 10 times more visits to inpatient units for the group that had comorbid anxiety, depression. There was 1.5 times, nearly twice the rate of emergency room visits, more than twice the rate of outpatient visits, more than 5 times the rate of visits to specialists, and about 6 times the rate of use of psychotherapy in the comorbid group compared to the ADHD only group. So it's clear that when it comes to using healthcare services, particularly mental health services, the comorbid group uses these services more than the ADHD only group of children. When we look at cost, the ADHD only group was about $4,000 for the period examined here. That's per year of costs versus over $8,600 for the group with comorbidity. So overall, all-cause healthcare costs were much higher in the comorbid group than in the ADHD only group, but they were still elevated in the ADHD only group if we compare them to healthcare usage in the general population, which of course this study did not do. But we know that healthcare costs are at least double or triple the cost of the average child when a child has ADHD. Now, they did find that if you broke these cases down by ADHD only, anxiety only, depression only, and both, the healthcare costs escalated as a function of comorbidity. So ADHD with anxiety only was about $7,300 per year. Remember, it was nearly $4,000 for the ADHD only group. If we look at the depression group, it was considerably higher, more than double the rate of the ADHD only group at $9,900. And if we look at the group that had anxiety and or depression, sometimes both, the cost per year was almost $14,000. That's more than three times the cost of ADHD only. So overall, the paper concludes that while ADHD is an expensive disorder when it comes to healthcare utilization, comorbid ADHD with anxiety, depression is considerably worse, with more visits across various aspects of healthcare and higher costs. So very interesting study there out of the US. Okay, our next paper up is done by some colleagues of mine, both in the Netherlands, and that's Jan Budelaar and Nanda Romels, and of course, Julie Rucklidge down in New Zealand. So this is a multinational paper, and it's comparing two different approaches to diet treatment of ADHD in comparison as well to treatment as customary and usual, which is usually medication combined with or just alone parent training and classroom management. So it could be any of those three or all of them in the treatment as usual group. Okay, so they compared, first of all, what is called the elimination diet or the red diet over in the Netherlands. This is a very restricted diet in which, I'll show you down here, children are subjected to removal of a number of substances, let's keep moving down here, from their diet. As it says here under elimination diet, their goal was to exclude foods they thought were provoking ADHD and dysregulation problems as a result primarily of allergies to foods. So they were eliminating a variety of substances, particularly as it says here, they were interested in getting rid of dyes, flavorings, additives, but also sugars, histamine-containing foods, or foods that might provoke a histemic reaction in the individual. So a very restricted diet, as you can imagine, very hard to follow. Earlier reports done by the developer of this diet, who is Leidy Pelzer, suggested that her research found dramatic improvements in these children. I've written earlier papers questioning the results of her studies and also pointing out that she has a conflict of interest here because she also markets this diet through her ability to franchise other clinics to use it. But besides that, this is a diet that's hard to adhere to, but is believed to result in dramatic improvements in children, even in comparison to medications. So a very interesting challenge here with that diet. The second diet that they compared children to was just a healthy diet following the Netherlands guidelines from their nutrition center. It's primarily removing sugars, also adding fiber, adding foods that contain vitamins and minerals, getting rid of salt and saturated fats. So what the Dutch believe to be a relatively healthy diet for children, not quite as difficult to adhere to as the elimination diet, but still requires a certain amount of time and investment. And then there is the care as usual treatment, which, as I said, involved giving the children primarily medication or behavioral parent training or classroom management or all of the above. That's pretty traditional offerings for treating children with ADHD, both here in the US and over in the Netherlands. Okay, so what did they find? They found that the elimination diet did not work as well as treatment as usual or the healthy diet approach. And the healthy diet and treatment as usual were comparable overall in their impact on children. So this study shows that the elimination diet was not as effective as the other programs in terms of degree of improvement at the 1-year prospective follow-up of these cases. They also found that only 24% of the children assigned to the elimination diet continued to comply with that diet at follow-up at 1 year, versus 37% of those receiving the healthy diet at 1 year. And then we have the treatment as usual group. So as I'm pointing out, the diets didn't appear to make much difference. The elimination diet was actually less effective than the treatment as usual diet. And consequently, at this point, it appears that neither of these diets necessarily need to be recommended for the treatment of ADHD, but it wouldn't be a bad idea to implement the healthy diet for other reduction of risk in children. As we know, ADHD children are prone to rather poor diets that are rich in carbohydrates, in sugars, and are rather reduced in nutrients, vitamins, and minerals, not to mention fiber. So not a bad idea to implement a diet like that, but don't get all caught up in adhering to the diet strictly, because at this point it didn't seem to result in any improvements and may not have been as good as treatment as usual in the case of that elimination diet. So a very nice randomized controlled trial there with regard to the effects of diet on child ADHD symptoms. My next paper, published over in the journal Frontiers in Neurology, is a large meta-analysis of studies that looked at exposure of mothers to anti-seizure medications during pregnancy and the subsequent risk for autism or ADHD in their offspring. Now, as you know, most people don't have a seizure disorder, but for mothers who do and who become pregnant, this is answering a very important question for them, and that is, does taking my seizure medication increase my risk of having a child with a neurodevelopmental disorder, in this case, autism spectrum or ADHD? The meta-analysis found that initially, exposure to an anticonvulsant and anti-seizure medication during pregnancy doubled the odds of the offspring having autism spectrum disorder. That only increased the odds by about 50% for individuals having ADHD. Now, interestingly enough, when they compared the women taking seizure medication to women who had been treated for a psychiatric disorder or had taken medication before pregnancy but stopped during pregnancy, the increase in the odds of autism were much lower, about 1.3 times. In other words, about a 38% increase in risk. So that's very important, because you need to control for the psychiatric condition of the mother, because it could be that is increasing the odds of the child having autism or ADHD. In other words, the mother has the same disorder and it's being genetically transmitted to the child, and the exposure to the anti-seizure medication is just sort of what you would call a red herring, or a signal, a marker that the mother has genetically based problems that are being transmitted onward. So again, we've talked about this before repeatedly in this kind of epidemiological or public health approach to studying ADHD or autism. It's correlational data. It cannot be used to interpret causation one way or the other, even though in some of these cases, authors of studies like this try to interpret their results as signifying causation. That is not the case. And kudos to these authors for not trying to do so, and even for pointing out that although there was a significant association with anti-seizure medication, it was relatively small, particularly after comparing these women on medication to women with other psychiatric disorders or seizure disorders that were not treated in pregnancy. So again, some relationship of risk. By the way, the authors found it was primarily for the drug valproate, not for the other drugs, but still remember, strictly correlational, not a sign of cause. Okay, enough about that. Now I want to talk to you about a study that comes to us from child and adolescent psychiatry and mental health. This is a study done by Chinese experts. It is a study of the Taiwan database, pardon me, and it's a study of the extent to which exposure to antibiotic use during the first few years of life increases the risk of autism or ADHD in the offspring. There has been some suggestive evidence that early exposure, particularly to higher doses of antibiotics during the first 2 years of life, might increase risk for these neurodevelopmental disorders. This is a paper that uses the entire population database, the National Healthcare Registry in Taiwan, to answer that question. So we're looking at millions of cases here are being studied. There were nearly 1 million children that were single birth. There were almost 1.2 million children that had full siblings in the study besides the index individual. And there were about 350,000 children where one sibling got the medication and another sibling did not during that first 2 years of life. In any case, what do they find? There was a very slight increase in the odds of children having autism spectrum or ADHD in the single cohort, that is the singletons in this study, and even less so in the full sibling cohort. So all this simply means is that there was about a 2 to 3% increase in risk, negligible. And as the authors point out, that could be explained by other factors, one of which I just mentioned in the previous study, that people who give antibiotics to their children, that these people might not necessarily be a cross-section of the population, but could represent people who are more likely to have adult ADHD or autism. I mean, we don't know one way or the other, and there could be a genetic risk here that's being transmitted. But overall, what the paper points out, and it's a credit to the authors for saying so, is that there is such a small marginal increase in risk of using antibiotics during the first 2 years of life that basically one shouldn't worry about it. One should not deter the use of antibiotics in a reasonable or timely fashion. So essentially, no real compelling evidence here of a risk from using those drugs during the first 2 years of life. My last study up is going to be a rather technical one, but it was interesting to me, and I thought I could use it to perhaps educate you or remind you, if you've seen my earlier videos on the causes of ADHD, particularly genetics, about one aspect of genetics that isn't mentioned very often, and that is what is called de novo mutations. A de novo mutation in DNA simply means that the mutated gene is not found in either parent, and yet it occurs in the child. So some things happened between the transmission of genes from parent to child during which a mutation occurs in certain genes. We know that we are constantly bombarded by possible mutation factors, mutagens, such as sunlight, radiation, toxins, plastics, trauma, other things that can affect our eggs and sperm that might lead to mutations in the genes in the egg and sperm that then get transmitted to the child but are not found in the parent's DNA from their blood samples or other samples. So the mutation occurs sometime during the transmission to the child. We know that about 10% of ADHD cases arise from de novo mutations. There's no evidence of the disorder in the family. There's no evidence, therefore, of inheritance. And yet the child seems to have some mutations in their genes not seen in the parents. This study found that this was in fact the case, that there was a higher rate of de novo mutations in ADHD cases they specifically identify one particular gene, but point out that their database shows that there could be over 1,000 genes that might be subject to mutations that would then elevate the risk of ADHD in that individual. We know that ADHD arises from multiple genes. Each gene contributes a very small increase in risk, but if you get enough of these genes or enough of these mutations, it's going to push you further out on the spectrum of ADHD to the point of having clinical disorder. So it suggests that ADHD is a very complex disorder involving multiple genes, some of which have been subjected to these new or de novo mutations. So very important work there, further solidifying the role that de novo mutations might have in giving rise to new cases of ADHD in the population. All right, a lot of different studies there, a lot of different topics that we've covered. I hope you found this Saturday morning's research review to be informative and got a laugh out of those rather silly dad jokes. As always, if you're not a subscriber, please subscribe to the channel if you like it. If you know people that might benefit from the content on this channel, please recommend it to others. I deeply appreciate that. And I'll see you here next week for more commentaries and research reviews on ADHD. And as I always sign off, live well, be well, and take care. Thanks, everybody.